All right, are we ready? Yeah. It's 7 o'clock. We can get started. I'm just gonna. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess we all know what to do, so we can get started. Okay. Yeah. That's good to me.
Hello, my name is Joe Reffermat. I'm a junior here at Boston College. I'm studying mathematics with a minor in philosophy and theology. I'm a member of Boston College Libertarians. Very excited to be debating tonight. We meet once a week on Thursdays in this room, and we discuss current events, political theory, political history through a libertarian lens. And we do movie nights, debates. We had a debate with Platypus last year. That was a lot of fun. And we have a debate tonight with BC Democrats. We'll be talking about Zoran Mondani's approach to rent control in New York City, and Patrick will be up later to talk about Ukraine and our anti-interventionist geopolitics. I think it would be helpful before we begin to lay out Zoran's actual policies. So on his website it says, as mayor, Zoran will immediately freeze the rent for all stabilized tenants and use every available resource to build the housing New Yorkers need and bring down the rent. According to his website, more than 2 million New Yorkers live in rent-stabilized apartments. He also wants to build 200,000 new rent-stabilized units over the next 10 years. However, it's important to note that all of these new buildings will also be under the same rent control stipulations. We'll get to the harm that these policies will cause soon. Whatever would like to be discussed, we can talk about the effects of rent control, the data in the cities that they're employed in, the plain economics of price controls, whatever direction the Democrats would like to tackle. But since Zoran's position is clear for now, I'll take a seat and let the Democrats get started.
All right, my name's Tom. I'm a sophomore here at BC. I'm political director for Boston College Democrats. And, thanks for hosting us. And I'd like to just begin by going over the context of this debate and of our political dispute here. And let's start with the nature of the Democratic Party. Now, I would make the case that the Democratic Party right now is about as culturally relevant as the Libertarian Party. Because even though we have just over 210 seats in the House and 47 Senate seats, there's next to no control over the cultural narrative. Like, people don't view the Democrats as capable of doing anything. They don't view them as effective legislatures. And quite honestly, I'm a bit embarrassed to be calling myself a Democrat in this debate right here. Now, the main reason for this is because Democrats like to posture their party as a big tent party. And that's probably because while the Sanders AOC Mondani wing is ascendant right now, at the end of the day, they have to grapple with a corporate establishment that serves very different goals that the party base wants them to achieve. So, given that this debate is happening with that and also under a rising tide of fascism, I'd argue, I'd like this debate to help us facilitate inter-party dialogue and also allow us an opportunity to establish that progressive politics are quite consistent with many libertarian principles. Namely, I would argue that John Locke, who is maybe not reflective of certain schools of thought of libertarianism, but definitely an intellectual forefather, I would argue, informs a lot of the progressive policies and general attitudes that Connor and I are going to put forward today. Property as a product of one's labor, the necessity of entering into a state of society in order to defend people's rights. And that brings us to the main contentions that we're going to bring up today. So, under the question of rent control, our response to this question is going to be informed by the truth that so long as we live in a society of capitalist states, economic freedom necessitates government intervention. We believe that in order for common citizens to be able to participate freely in exchange of goods and services and to produce those goods and services, there needs to be a common set of ground rules by which everyone can play in order to prevent power, in this case money, from concentrating in the hands of an unelected and untrustworthy few. For the question of Ukraine, our answer to it will be informed by the principle that the United States needs to protect Ukrainian sovereignty out of both obligation and practicality. Not only because it's morally right for us to uphold the treaties that we have got into, but also because increased Russian hegemony in Europe does not lead to a better condition for the people of Ukraine, the people of Russia, global stability in general, and the fact that Russian governance is not consistent with libertarian principles, I think should serve as a form of common ground between us. So with that, we're going to move to the question over economics. And what I want us to all keep in mind here is that I think unlike the Democrats and Republicans, the Democrats and Libertarians do share a common and sincere belief in promoting freedom as much as possible. Obviously, we differ in the manners in which we want to achieve those goals, but at the end of the day, we do believe that government should have less influence on the lives of people, while we believe it should have more influence on institutions, and that to the extent that government should exist, it should protect the rights of the individual. So I hope that can inform the discussion going forward, and let's start with rent control.
Thank you, Tom, for getting started. I'm Connor. I'm also a sophomore here. And I'd like to first set out our goal, like Tom said, in discussing Mamdani's approach to rent regulation and also rent regulation in a broader context of the entire United States. And that is to establish the necessity of individual liberty from the burden of rent and excessive upcharge of rent by not only landlords, but corporate establishments and capitalism as a whole. I'd like to also start by defining Mamdani's goals for rent control a little more, and also rent control itself. The connotation generally for rent control is a sort of fixed cap or a maximum that one is allowed to charge on a unit. And the Rent Guidelines Board in New York City actually separates pretty distinctly rent control and rent stabilization into two different things. Rent control, they fix a new cap every 2 years for rent controlled apartments. Rent stabilization, they simply leave it up to a board of legislators to decide on the amount that they will allow rent increases. Rent controlled apartments in New York City are currently very uncommon. There's only about 24,000 of them, according to the New York City Office of the Comptroller. And there's also about 960,000 rent stabilized units. So rent stabilization, far more common. And what we'd like to get at here, and what I think Zoran himself is getting at, is that the market does not create fair, equal, and liberating housing outcomes for the majority. The majority of New York sitters, according to the Office of the Comptroller, again, are considered rent burden. So they spend more than 30% of their income just on rent. And nearly a third of low-income renters spend at least half of their income on rent. And we don't believe that this promotes individual freedom, economic freedom of any kind. The housing market is supposed to be free, but tell that to landlords, because anti-competitive behavior harms the housing market. A DOJ analysis indicates that if price coordination was limited, there would be a significant economically meaningful decrease in price markups for rental units and unit pricing algorithms as a whole. What Zoran wants to put forth is a rent freeze of existing stabilized apartments. He doesn't want to set a cap on all apartments in New York City or regulate caps, rent guidelines across the board. He wants to take currently rent stabilized units and freeze the rent on those. That doesn't have to be a permanent fix. It's meant to be economic relief that combats the rising tide of rent and the stagnant rise of wages in New York City and across the board. So some misconceptions of rent control that I wanted to highlight. Oftentimes people assume strictly that rent and housing will follow the sort of Econ 1 basic supply and demand, model that we all learned. But it's just really much more complicated than this. There's a lot of collaboration in pricing by landlords that allow them to unfairly raise pricing and price out certain groups of people out of the market. We'd also like to establish that there is precedent for rent control working. Germany specifically has extensive rent control laws, and almost half of their population is renters, and they don't live in any kind of ramshackle housing in some crunch market. It can certainly work. We'd also like to mention that Zoran does not plan on allowing it to reduce the volume of housing. Rent control specifically reduces the volume of housing specifically designated for renting. However, his response to this is to build more housing, especially more government-owned housing, public housing, things of that nature. And this is supposed to be economic relief. It applies to only 2 million rent-stabilized tenants, And freezing the rent, unlike Eric Adams, who under his administration saw rent increases of 9%, will allow the economic stimulus of allowing wages to catch up with rising rent. And the rest of his platform complements this. It includes more affordable housing, supply-side solutions, ensuring landlords fulfill maintenance obligations, things of that nature that improve quality of living, and also enforce laws against deed theft and malpractice from landlords. Broader issue, we'd like to emphasize that we do not believe housing can be both a human right and an appreciable asset. A city like Paris, for example, is nearly twice as population dense as New York City. And we hear very often that we don't think it's possible to build more housing, or how is the government going to effectively maintain public housing in such a dense, crowded New York City. But it is possible if we get rid of the notion that housing is an appreciable asset, is a commodity, and rather we establish that it is a human right that enables individual freedom and economic freedom.
I'd like to start with a quote from Jason Furman, former chair of Barack Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. He said, "Rent control has been about as disgraced as any economic policy in the toolkit." First thing I'd like to mention is what I found to be the largest data set ever compiled on the studies of rent control and the effects of it. In the 2024 Journal of Housing Economics, the head of the German Institute for Economic Research did a meta-study of international reports from 1967 to 2023. He concluded, although rent control appears to be very effective in achieving lower rents for families in controlled units, its primary goal, it also results in a number of undesired effects, including, among others, higher rents for uncontrolled units, lower mobility, and reduced residential construction. These undesired effects are exactly what I would like to focus on. We just heard a lot of good intent regarding rent control and rent stabilization. That's all well and good, but to ignore the unintended effects that result would be, I think, extremely problematic, and that's what you'll see in the data. I'm not arguing that rent control does not actually lower rent in rent-stabilized apartments. Of course it does. That's what it's intended to do. I'm claiming that the unintended effects are so severe and problematic that not only outweighs the benefit of a percentage of the population having cheaper rent, but it ought to be thrown out completely from New York City and every city around the world. I hope at the end of my evidence presented that you agree with me. Obama's chair of economic advisors already happens to. The Kent A. Clark Center for Global Markets in 2012 polled 41 leading economists on rent control in San Francisco and in New York. They were asked if they thought rent control policies had a positive effect on the amount and quality of affordable housing. How many answered in the affirmative? 1 out of 41. There's a mountain of evidence against rent control and a plethora of fallout effects. And I look forward to discussing these.
Now, we can move on to the rebuttal part, saying 5 minutes.
All right, so yeah, there's probably a good number of neoliberal economists who would make the case that rent control, when applied to American contexts, will lead to higher construction costs, lower mobility for renters, and other negative outcomes. But again, I'd like to situate these effects right here in the context of the American economy, because as it remains that the majority of our housing is private, is not made for affordable purposes, is market rate, is not located near transit, all impacts the overall calculus as to how policymakers view rent control and how rent control actually works in terms of its impact on renters and citizens in general. What I'd like to re-impress upon the Libertarian team is that, again, in countries such as Germany, rent control is very common, but not because it's a panacea, because they have other understandings of housing that fundamentally differ from the American understanding. And that's what I'd like to get at in this argument right here. Because even though rent control in an American context may appear as though a basic price floor or price ceiling, when the housing market is so crunched by both our lack of supply by collusion among landlords and by other negative impacts associated with a deregulated and non-competitive market, we see that it becomes a lot harder to judge the impact of rent control policies. So I'd like to return to the DOJ analysis that Connor mentioned in his previous speech about how there is currently collusion among landlords to make sure that rents remain high and remain profitable to them. This is one of the key roadblocks that prevents us from actually understanding how to tackle the housing issue. Because since housing has been put in the control of the suppliers, not the people who have demand for housing, we've seen a completely lopsided debate in the United States. Other countries don't have this issue because they understand housing to be a social right. Next, I'd like to make the point also that, again, rent control is not the main issue that we are putting forward here. And I appreciate that the Libertarians have read the other parts of Mamdani's plan, but when we add more supply to the market, particularly the rent control market, the basic Econ 101 curve should not be the main framework through which we are working. Because again, when we add more supply, we'll be able to stabilize the market overall. The fact remains that America is woefully behind the rest of the world in terms of its building rates and in terms of the ability it has, not in terms of the ability, in terms of the tediousness it takes to build housing. Now, so people like Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, who I have other disagreements with, have put forward this argument in the form of the abundance agenda. And this, I think, this argument right here, I think, is reconcilable between our two positions, because while it is ultimately a supply-side solution, if the simple fact is we do not have enough houses to house everyday Americans, namely both market rate and affordable housing, we're not actually going to be able to solve this problem, whether it be through rent control or whether it be through a perfectly deregulated market like the Libertarians are proposing right here. The question that I want to ask to the Libertarian team, that I hope they'll be able to answer in their rebuttal, is whether or not housing should be completely left to the devices of the free market. Because right now, it might as well be. Although certain cities in the United States do have rent control policies, and although they mentioned San Francisco and, what was it, Los Angeles?
New York City.
And New York, sorry, and New York City. It's interesting that they mentioned San Francisco because at the same time, San Francisco has a policy of rent decontrol, whereby tenants in rent-controlled apartments may be, upon their leaving, may have their apartments be returned to market rate housing, which in San Francisco will obviously be significantly higher and significantly less affordable, reducing the likelihood that lower income tenants may be able to live there. And while this doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world on paper, it has incentivized a lot of high turnover rates, and I can send you guys the evidence for this if you want to see it. So, with that in mind, I'll pose the question again. What do we do about housing if the free market has already proven the fact that it is not producing good outcomes for the majority of renters? Because as prices rise, and as governments refuse to intervene if they act on the philosophy of the Libertarian team right here, how are we going to be able to house more and more Americans and make sure that they can pursue fulfilling lives both in the economic sphere, whether it be through finding jobs in urban centers, and both socially speaking, as in not dying on the street? So that's what I'd like to ask. You want the evidence, or
We trust. Oh, yeah, there's not.
All right.
I'm good. I just heard it suggested that we live in a completely free market for housing, and that a free market for housing is not the solution because what we have right now does not work. But they also suggested that, I think the number was 960,000 current units of rent stabilization in New York City. So I'm not exactly sure how free markets could be the problem when you already have almost 1 million units that are rent stabilized in New York City alone. So my answer to the question of whether or not housing should be left to the free market is absolutely it should be. Because you can't point to current failures that are not in a free market situation as a failure of a hypothetical free market housing situation. Now I'll move on to my evidence of the effects of rent control. A 2003 American Economic Review study found that 21% of New Yorkers live in apartments with more or fewer rooms than they would if they were in an unregulated market. One of the benefits of a price mechanism is that it allocates goods to those who value them the most. Artificially interfering with this mechanism, especially to the extent of rent control, results in severe misallocations, leaving families cramped in tiny apartments and childless couples in larger ones. This is why Andrew Cuomo, who's running against Zoran currently, proposed Zoran's Law, which would restrict higher earners from rent-controlled housing upon learning that Zoran himself resided in a rent-controlled apartment. This is still an issue, even though that study was in 2003. 16% of current New Yorkers in rent-stabilized housing earn more than $150,000 a year, according to the Citizens Budget Commission. Another issue with rent control is the reduced quality of the regulated housing. 2017 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey found that 64% of controlled units had maintenance deficiencies compared to 47% of unregulated units. Even when adjusted for age, these buildings are still twice as likely to have major maintenance issues. Impact is less severe in programs that allow for gradual rent increases, but the effects are still seen. They also result in higher rents in unregulated markets. If the true goal for rent control was lower rent for everyone, then they should take into account that when you put a price control on a regulated market, that spikes the rent of the unregulated market. The 2025 review of rent control in New York City found rents in unregulated apartments were 22 to 25% higher than they would have been without rent control. This is because of several factors. Landlords may need to raise their rent in unregulated apartments to recoup the losses they suffer from the below market price regulated apartments. I'm not here to make you sympathetic to landlords, so here are some other factors that could be responsible. It could be the increased demand for unregulated apartments due to landlords putting more time and more investment into those unregulated apartments. And it also could be because of a decrease in supply for those unregulated markets due to rent control. Another factor is that rent-controlled apartments don't inherently benefit the poor. There's no guarantee that those who benefit from below market rate apartments are poor. In Boston, our city, 26% of rent-controlled housing was occupied by the city's poorest quarter, while 30% was occupied by the richest half. In New York City and St. Paul, a study found that benefits of rent control were higher for rich and white tenants than poor and minority tenants. Why is this the case? When you don't allocate apartments by price, you have to pick another mechanism. Whatever this mechanism is, it's not guaranteed to be inherently pro-poor. Rent control also limits the new housing supply that could be created. In 2021, St. Paul, Minnesota capped rent increases at just 3% a year. Did this result in a surplus of better, affordable housing? No. Building permits for new housing plummeted 80% in St. Paul immediately after. Here's the kicker. In neighboring Minneapolis, building permits increased 70%. A nearly one-to-one displacement of housing permits due to the fact that new housing in St. Paul was also rent capped at 3%. If new housing is exempt from rent control, which Zoran's would not be because it's also built by the government, it can have little to no effect. However, it's important to note that rent control still undermines the supply of any rentable accommodation it affects. Any new housing is a reflection of the distortion that price controls inflict on the housing market. Finally, I'd like to propose a sort of economic calculation problem regarding rent control. Currently, rent-stabilized properties, as mentioned in New York, have their rent determined by a 9-member board appointed by the mayor. This board votes on the allowable rent increase as a percentage each year. The board considers the financial struggle of renters, as well as what landlords may need to keep their apartments in good shape. I contend that, like anything, any metric the government uses to determine the price of the rent-stabilized apartments will be more arbitrary and less informed than the actual market price. That is the function of price, and when you interfere with a mechanism that will always be more informed than a local government board of 9 mayoral appointees, you reap all of the aforementioned consequences for your city. This has already been happening to New York City, which is why they have a current housing crisis and current cost of living crisis that will probably get Mamdani elected, actually, ironically enough. But I would prefer to see the situation remedied rather than exacerbated under Zoran's policies by turning to actual free market policies like reducing the zoning regulations, increasing like floor to air ratios, decreasing housing density restrictions, and eliminating single family zoning requirements. These are all things that can be done in New York City that they claimed was a deregulated market currently, which is not because you have all these restrictions that would actually alleviate and increase the housing supply, which is how you get better, more affordable, and a larger supply of housing, unlike rent control. Thank you.
All right.
So now we're going to move on to the second part of the debate, which is going to be about foreign policy and specifically about Ukraine. Who would like to go first? Okay, what's yours?
Now, our perspective on foreign policy is not purely ideological. We also believe in a good deal of pragmatism. And that's not to say that we're about to bring up some ridiculous neocon arguments right here, but our goal, both as progressives and as libertarians, should be world peace. And that, a lot of that comes through global stability. And right now, as it appears to us, the prospect of Russia gaining territory in Ukraine and potentially annexing significant portions of the country, maybe even all of it, would not contribute to global stability, nor would it produce a condition in Europe that is consistent with libertarian values. So let's begin with Ukraine before moving on to other geopolitical conflicts that inform our worldview on this subject. And with regard to Ukraine, I want to explain our support for it through two key lenses. First, that we have an obligation to do so, and second, that is the only practical solution to ensuring peace in Europe and the world abroad. Now, world stability rests on the assumption that the United States will support its allies and uphold its treaties. This has been the bedrock for a relatively peaceful time in world history over the last 80 years. Obviously, the global south sees a myriad of conflicts, but generally speaking, since World War II ended and since the United States has taken a key diplomatic leadership role, we have seen substantially more international cooperation and substantially less needless violence. Swiftly overthrowing the system, as the current administration seems to be toying with doing, would not promote world peace. An immediate withdrawal on the part of the United States would plunge Europe into turmoil, would cause Europe to pursue more militaristic actions on its own, and would leave a power vacuum in the East that could be filled by authoritarian actors such as Russia and China, which, again, I don't think are very consistent with the principles that you guys want to put forward. And we've seen this happen in real time. Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, has stated that Europe should militarize more. The Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, has said that reliance on the American world order is effectively over. And in fact, recent conferences hosted by the Brookings Institution, liberal internationalists, I get it, but nonetheless, the Europeans in attendance there all basically agreed that it is time for Europe to start nuclearizing. That is not a good outcome, and I think American withdrawal from the world stage, diplomatically mainly, but also, in this case, militarily, would only produce more chaos as a result of that. And with that, let's move on to the issue of practicality. Now, I want to make it clear that Connor and I's position is not that Ukraine should keep fighting. They've already made that choice on their own. Our position is that so long as we align ourselves with this flawed democratic country against an oligarchic autocracy, the United States should continue to support it for the sake of maintaining European political stability. And the United States has only spent $175 billion on Ukrainian aid since the war in 2022, compared to an annual military budget of $850 billion per year. And by the end of this administration, it'll likely reach $1 trillion. The fact that this is a war of attrition right now speaks to the solid return on investment that this aid has provided. If it were not for our aid, Russia would likely have conquered Ukraine and will have expanded its border with NATO countries, only producing more instability in the future. The central question here is Russian expansion better or worse for Europe? Because if it leads to nuclear proliferation, as the countries at the Brookings Conference stated it may, and if it increases the number of people living under an oligarchic and authoritarian form of government, I think the answer is pretty clearly no. Now, let's reconcile that with our broader worldview on foreign policy. The case that we're making here is one of non-interventionism informed by human rights, not pure isolationism. Because the reason why we believe these things is because we think the United States should commit itself diplomatically to support countries around the world when necessary. And this is one of the reasons why we would be so critical of American support for Israel at the moment. Because while Israel is waging an unambiguous genocide in Gaza right now, the United States has been supporting them to the tune of billions of dollars per year. We would not support that. And I think in this instance, for the United States to actively withdraw from this region would not throw the world into turmoil in the same way that it would in the case of Europe. The United States should join the chorus of nations that are currently recognizing Palestinian sovereignty and condemning the far-right Netanyahu government as a means to put diplomatic and economic pressure on Israel to either change its policy or to change its form of government such that it does not abuse Palestinian human rights. This is based on our principle of supporting human rights worldwide. The reason why we support Ukraine is a practical reason. And while it may help the military-industrial complex, which we will concede is true, we don't believe that simply sticking it to this arm of capital is worth allowing Russia to increase its foothold in Europe. So again, returning to our central question, is the world better off or worse off when the United States withdraws and allows significantly less free countries to gain influence? If we want to achieve a system of multipolarity and end American hegemony, we need to do so through strategic and measured means, not by simply withdrawing and abdicating all responsibility that we've built up over the last 80 years. Thank you.
You guys have been really good on time, by the way, so far. Everything's good.
It's good.
I'd like to thank my opponent for recognizing the situation going on in Gaza. It's very good to see that some people understand that war is not always such a great thing. I'd also like to show some sympathy for the people of Ukraine and for the innocent people of Russia who have suffered during this conflict. Since February 24th, 2022, 1 million casualties have occurred on the Russian side, and another 400,000 on the Ukrainian side. That's nearly 1.5 million people dead, wounded, sick, missing, or captured. And I desire to see that end, as do all libertarians. But the only way to do that is for either the U.S. to end support of Ukraine immediately, or to push for a peace deal, in which we are willing to cede land to Russia. There is no chance of Ukrainian victory. Putin is not likely to be removed from power. Navalny's dead. He was never that popular. The closest he got to political power was running for mayor in 2014, and he got like 5% of the vote. Ukraine likely does not have the manpower to launch any more major offensives that could secure lost territory. Putin does not want to lose Ukraine. He's willing to throw bodies at them until he maintains control over Donetsk, Luhansk, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, also parts of Kharkiv, Sumy, and a little bit of Mykolaiv. And all our efforts to oppose them have failed. Our sanctions haven't worked. Their economy is not as bad as people say it is. They keep saying it's about to crash. It's not. It grew 4.2% last year. And while that growth rate is slowing a little bit, it's not by much. And it's only pushed Russia closer to our other opponents, China. It's also drawn India into the mix. Now, people tend to believe that this story begins with Russia taking Crimea in 2014. And while they have the date right, they don't have the issue right. It began when the government of Ukraine was overthrown. Perhaps when the President Yanukovych was overthrown, but when he was after being democratically elected. Now, some people will claim he was a Russian plant or a Russian toady. But that's not true. He was initially pro-joining the EU, with some reservations, of course, because there were some issues with the deal the EU was giving them, mostly for unattainable financial reasons. But he chose to side with Russia because they offered him a better deal, even with its own costs. And when he fled to Russia, as Assad did, it's because he wasn't popular in the other countries around him. Because what he heard was that people wanted to support the people that overthrew him. They wanted to see him gone. They wanted to see him possibly dead. And that's not to include the major corruption in Ukraine that existed before and after that revolution. The Svoboda Party is a neo-Nazi organization, and it helped with the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014. Zelensky was backed by a crooked billionaire, Kolomoisky, who was arrested, but he also jailed his political opponent when he was running for election, Poroshenko. Trumped up charges of treason. He was funding pro-Russian rebels in the East. Except Poroshenko was very pro-EU, and he was supported by these neo-Nazi organizations. So why would the guy who was against joining Russia be funding the people who wanted to join Russia? Not to mention that both Poroshenko and Zelensky were found to have been tax evaders. Not necessarily that libertarians have a problem with tax evasion, but perhaps their opponents do. Zelensky has postponed presidential elections up until the end of the war. Mind you, Abraham Lincoln had elections during the Civil War. And according to a Gallup poll in 2025, 69% of all Ukrainians favor a negotiated end to the conflict with an implied willingness to cede territory for it to end. This is essentially a reversal of polling data from 2022, when 70% supported continuing the war. Because this war requires conscription and gangs to kidnap people to staff as armies, which have failed to retake any appreciable territory since the beginning of the war, or at least since their feign attack in late 2022. And they're suffering a demographic crisis. Even prior to the war, Ukraine had an aging population. Now, the army is staffed by older generations because they aren't drafting younger generations. They want to keep the Ukrainian ethnicity alive. Lindsey Graham, a known neocon, he went to Ukraine and pushed Zelensky to draft these younger ones, which, to his credit, Zelensky ignored. Unfortunately, there's only one way this war ends, and that's either, or there's two ways this war ends, but that's either through more death and Ukraine's territory being taken, or less death and Ukraine's territory being taken. And for my part, for all libertarians, I'd like to see less people die. Thank you.
Now we can move on to rebuttal. Yes. You can take it. You don't have to worry about the time.
Oh.
Yeah. I got all that.
All right. First, I'd like to start off by, again, reestablishing our position that we support support of Ukraine, not just strictly on the moral premise of wanting war to end and wanting Russia's oligarchic and dictatorial government to power to continue to reign, but also out of practicality and out of encouraging stability in Europe and the world as a whole. Now, as you did note, there are significant issues in Ukraine's government. You know, if you ask, is the government corrupt? Well, a Gallup poll from this year says that 85% Ukrainians say yes, government is corrupt. And that's true, that's a problem. You mentioned Zelensky's tax evasion himself. However, Zelensky's approval rating himself is at 67%. The institutional confidence of the military, this poll put at 85%, even higher. So there is an amount of unification within Ukraine in this ongoing effort. And we'd like to ask the question, does corruption in the Ukrainian government mean that they should surrender to Russia and allow Russia to grow its border with the rest of Europe and further destabilize the region? A major nuclear power, by the way, as well. U.S. intervention, U.S. foreign policy doesn't need to look like it did in the early 2000s, where we sent troops into the Middle East to topple governments in search of weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. These set bad examples and bad precedents for how foreign policy can go wrong, and rather we hope that foreign policy seeks to help stabilize political and economic relationships between Europe and the US and between European countries themselves. We also don't believe that ending the war at all costs prevents future casualties. And like you said, the Russian death toll is incredibly high. And obviously so is Ukraine's, and both death tolls of innocents are incredibly tragic, but ending the war immediately doesn't prevent casualties in the future. It doesn't prevent Russia from starting new conflicts or funding proxy wars that just lead to more death and destruction. What we instead need, and we're not saying that we don't want an end to the war, of course we do, of course we want fighting to stop, but we need to assert that Russia's influence cannot grow, and their border in Europe and their influence on that region cannot expand. And now, we do disagree with the nature that there's no hope for Ukraine in this war. Like you mentioned, yes, Russia's economy may still be growing, albeit slowing down. However, their budget deficit is growing quite fast as well. And their allies, notably China, Iran, the people bailing them out, eventually we have to ask, when will they keep putting up with this? When will they keep sending their money and their support to this Russian operation that continues to drag out much, much longer than Russia has thought it would? And this economic turmoil that Russia faces in their budget and also their declining economic growth cannot last forever. And what we'd also like to establish in what you may provide as a counter to our support of Ukraine, which is our affirmation that the U.S. should instead not support Israel, comes from the distinction that while Israel has been historically an ally of the U.S., we don't believe that their actions are aimed at the goal of stabilizing economic, political relationships in the region or in the world as a whole. Several states in Europe recently coming out condemning Israel, recognizing a Palestinian state, and yet Israel seems to have no intention of slowing down, just recently starting a ground operation in Gaza. And what they seek to do is destabilize the region even further. They've attacked several other Middle Eastern countries as well. And that is why we don't support sending money there. However, in Ukraine's case, their interests do support stabilization of democracy in Europe. And that is very, very important to not only Europe, but to us in our relationship with Europe and Europe's relationship with countries within each other as a whole. Because we would like to especially clarify that if Russia's border is to continue to expand, if we are to continue to appease Russia just in the sake of ending conflicts as soon as they happen, they're not going to stop. And like Tom said, we spent $175 billion in aid to Ukraine and $850 billion a year in U.S. military budget. That's a fraction of the budget that we spend. And while many argue that they would like to see the military budget reduced by even much more than that, it goes to show that this money could be better allocated. And we do believe that for our own interests, politically and economically, that is a much, much better use of our money than on things like domestic military budgets, and especially not all of the money that we spent to sent to Israel. Like,
My opponent claims that their intention is to uphold democracy and American values, such as democracy. What has that led us to around the world? Let's take Afghanistan. After 20 years, how many people have died? And guess who's in charge? The Taliban. Well, let's not stop there. Let's try Iraq. Still dictatorship. Yemen, starving. Libya, an open-air slave market. Somalia, also starving. Syria, under the head of, or led by Al-Qaeda, essentially. But it doesn't only end in the Middle East and North Africa. In Europe, since the fall of the Soviet Union, there have been revolutions in Serbia, Ukraine twice, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and a few other countries. But in each of these revolutions, it always happened to be a pro-Russian government that was overthrown by a pro-NATO government. Take Serbia, for example. Milosevic was overthrown by a collaboration of grassroots organizations that were funded by USA through its NGO subsidiaries, the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, etc., etc. This led to the Otpor group, a youth activist organization, who was then led to train activist organizations in Europe, or in Ukraine, in Georgia, and in Kyrgyzstan. In Georgia, when Saakashvili came to power, he attacked the Ossetia, sorry. I'm really bad at
You got the first one.
Ossetia. Okay, cool. Just make sure. I read, I don't listen. The Ossetia region. Of course, the news for a while said that it was Russia who attacked first. But then after the dust had settled, they went back and said, oh, it was actually Saakashvili who attacked first. And now Georgia's military is all but destroyed. In Kyrgyzstan, a similar story. Pro-Russian leader overthrown by pro-NATO activists. That's not all. My opponent claims it's not expensive. What's the current debt of the United States right now? 38 trillion? Current deficit a little over 2 trillion? Sure, the military budget's $1 trillion right now, or projected to be by the end of the year. But it doesn't matter because Ukraine is only total what did you say, 180 billion, a little less. And now we're offering to not have to or trying to word this correctly, excuse me, I didn't write this down. And now we're offering to rescind our loans. So essentially, we're not charging them for us helping them. So what are we getting out of it? War in Ukraine? So glad we could kill all those people. And to claim that this is something that's aside from a neoconservative movement, Dick Cheney helped to oversee the color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, as well as bringing in the Baltic states to NATO. Expansion of NATO has continued since the fall of the Soviet Union, despite promises to Yeltsin and other Russian leaders that this would not be the case. And sure, they'll claim that it was just word-of-mouth agreements, or it was just one agreement, but it was multiple. And not to mention, JFK's announcement to remove nuclear weapons was word of mouth, and the Soviets trusted him enough to do so, and they kept nukes out of Cuba, thus preventing a nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, sure, there were other ways to try and move Russia into our fold. The so-called Partnership for Peace program was put on the back burner as NATO absorbed other states into its sphere of influence. For us, it was intended as an off-ramp for former Warsaw Pact nations such as Poland, Poland and other Warsaw Pact states to join NATO. But to Russia, it was seen as encroachment. We promised them early on that we wouldn't try and encroach on their sphere of influence, something that they promised they wouldn't do for us. Imagine if Russia were to overthrow the government of Mexico and install a pro-Russian democracy there. How would we react? We'd say it was bad. Why can't we step into their shoes and realize that what we're doing is equally as bad?
Right. So we're done with this part of the debate as well, so we can move on to conclusion statements. We can talk about other part of the debate. We can talk about your ideas in general, like as Democrats. Yeah. Floor is yours.
All right, so while something of a rift may have formed between our views on foreign policy right here, I'd like to once again clarify that our mission here is to establish progressive principles that are consistent with libertarian values. And I think, in spite of our opponents' well-researchedness and intelligence here, particularly on the issue of foreign policy, they have been shadowboxing a imagined neoconservative opponent for a little bit. So I'd like to start by clearing up some misconceptions right there. We have never made the case that the United States is a benevolent force in the world. I've personally said in one of my speeches that we would like to achieve multipolarity at some point. You will never find me lining up to defend our entanglements in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, or any matter of Middle Eastern nations. I think we can agree on that. The reason why Ukraine is unique in this instance is because, number one, it is against a nuclear armed power. There are actual weapons of mass destruction there, unlike in Iraq. And also because the sincerity of Ukrainians desiring a European style of government is real, unlike the case in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. The arguments that libertarians here have made that the color revolutions in post-Soviet states largely served neoconservative interests and were backed by American intelligence are applicable in some cases, I'll give them that. But this is a very dubious claim for Ukraine, namely because while the United States was very vocally in support of the coup in 2014, the fact of the matter is the Ukrainian people took to the streets against their incumbent government. They have since reaffirmed it by voting for Zelensky, and that, again, polls suggest that there are two institutions in which they remain confident today, which is the presidency and the military. As long as Ukrainians themselves believe that they still should be fighting against the Russian invasion, it makes perfect sense for European nations that border it and for the US to support it in this endeavor. The idea that NATO expansion is a justification for Russia to invade these countries is completely ludicrous, because unless the Libertarian team could prove that NATO expansion is gearing up for some kind of invasion or aggression towards Russia, then I don't see any reason why the Russian government believes that they should retaliate in kind with military force. The supposed verbal agreement that President Bush, the elder, gave to Boris Yeltsin at the time, again, does not hold any water because, while you may try to draw the comparison to Cuba, in this day and age, treaties need to be done through written word and in a multilateral process. Does it suggest that George Bush was not a man of his word and that the United States can't be trusted? Of course, and that's a belief I have. But at the end of the day, a written treaty is obviously going to be much more cogent than a verbal one right there. Given that, the point that we are trying to impress upon this debate right here today is that we believe in these things because of a consistent support for human rights above all. We destabilized the Middle East. We destabilized Libya. We destabilized Afghanistan. Russia is in the process of destabilizing Ukraine. Obviously, their democracy was very messy in their post-Soviet years, and there are a myriad of corruption issues that we can discuss at a later time. None of those are going to be solved by them surrendering to the oligarchy that they share a border with. Further, moving on to economic issues, the guiding principle that informs our arguments here comes, again, from the belief that government intervention is necessary so long as money exists as a source of power in this country. Because as land and wealth are signifiers of influence, as those resources continue to concentrate at the top of our society, at the expense of people at the bottom, a less just and less overall efficient condition is reached. Concerning their arguments on rent control, the Libertarians make the point that because rent control exists in certain cities, we do not have a perfectly free market. And that they argue in favor instead for free market solutions like repealing zoning laws and for making cities more dense. This is something that we agree with right here. And what I want to hammer home right now is that rent control is one of many solutions that we would propose in tandem with some of the solutions that you would propose, such as repealing zoning laws. I don't think zoning laws are necessarily an example of a purely laissez-faire system, but the criticism that we are levying here is against ones that involve concentration of power. Zoning laws allow for concentration of power by allowing for the wealthy to self-segregate their homes in separate parts of cities while the poor are effectively priced out of these markets. Rent control allows for the poor to have a leg up and continue to participate in these markets, and certain regulations need to be imposed to make sure that all homes are accessible for all people. If cities are to be centers of commerce, the commerce should also include people on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. All that said, we believe that we share similar goals in this debate. In fact, given our opposition to certain foreign entanglements and our opposition to zoning laws, we even share similar policy prescriptions. What we want to make clear here is that progressivism can work together with libertarianism in a democratic system. The only question that remains is how seriously we take these democratic values and how willing we are to engage in the liberal and somewhat unjust apparatuses of the state in order to make sure that all people can live as free lives as possible. Thank you.
Perhaps the conclusion isn't as chock full of random facts. Our opponents think that they could solve or control every problem in the world. High rents, issues abroad. What they fail to understand is that force can rarely, if ever, solve these issues in the long run. What right does the US government have to be the enforcer? Since the first revolution in Ukraine, nationalist groups have held significant political sway. We are locked in what can almost be described as a proxy war, and we'll use that term very lightly, with the largest nuclear power in the world, at least by tonnage. This nuclear power sees us as encroaching on its borders, influencing the politics of its neighbors, and blaming it for many of the problems in our system. Russia hacked the election, Trump's a Russian puppet, Putin's price hike. And now, President Trump, the so-called peace candidate, is walking back on his interest in ending this conflict and signaling increased military support for Ukraine. What hope for there is peace now? Russia only loses this conflict if NATO gets involved on the ground in an offensive capacity, which, for years, we've been told would never be the case. I still like to believe it's true. Surely, if our government supports democracy as it claims to do, and if our opponents do, or as our opponents do, it would grant the Ukrainian people's wishes and cede land to Russia in order to end this conflict. As I said before, 69% of the population supports ending the war and ceding land. This should be our government's policy, peace with all, and unity towards all. Thank you.
All right, before we move on to the Q&A section, let's give a round of applause for the debates. Yeah, we can start asking questions to either side. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, I have a question for the Democrats. You made a very bold claim saying that basically Europe is politically more unstable than the Near East, because you said removing troops from Israel could be less impactful than drawing support from Ukraine. I was asking, do you have any facts to back it up beyond the rhetoric of European politicians that it would destabilize Europe if Ukraine were to lose the war?
Well, for the U.S. to withdraw from Europe, that would remove from Europe their number one protector, in the sense that we have nuclear armaments stationed there. If Europe pursues their own nuclear armaments, that obviously increases the number of nuclear powers on Earth, and I do not think that would be conducive to stability overall. And the reason why this is distinct from the issue of Israel-Palestine is because of a reason I think we can both agree on, which is that Europe is experiencing war and Palestine is experiencing a genocide. There is no conflict or exchange of territory that's going on in the Middle East that has results that would lead to a destabilization of the global order, or that would fundamentally change power dynamics there. The dynamic is already established and it's being greatly abused. The reason why Ukraine and Europe in general are distinct is because, as much as I would like a multipolar system to exist, if we do it in this way while a conflict is going on, Europe will not be any more peaceful. There will be more militarization of previously demilitarized nations, and we will be returning to a pre-World War I system of secret treaties and of perpetual conflict. And while this may sound like empty rhetoric right here, I think the fact that European leaders are warning about it so loudly does signal an actual understanding of the way that these international relations work. There has been buildups of troops along the border with the Baltic states. In return, Finland and Sweden joined NATO, which I'm sure you guys may be opposed to, and I don't exactly have a broadly positive opinion of, because it signals a further division in Europe. It's pretty clear that as Russia continues this war, the battle lines are going to be drawn, and that Europe is going to have a balance of power that is much more lopsided to the stronger, and in this case, the less free.
Well, I just wanted to say, most European countries are part of NATO. Ukraine is not part of NATO.
Yeah.
So if the Americans would stop their support for Ukraine, that would not mean that America would leave NATO. So NATO would still be one power bloc that would be consistent in and of itself, and that would not be affected by the loss of Ukraine, basically.
I mean, do you want to say?
Just briefly, I was going to say, I think part of the United States' commitment to NATO is to protect all NATO countries and the interests of NATO as a whole, which is to promote democracy and stability in Europe. Russia's mission very much so clearly opposes that. And I think it's unwise to heed Russia's talking points and Ukraine's talking points and the messages coming out of both of those countries equally. But we know the bias that Russia's media has, and I just think it's unrealistic to expect that Russia is going to stop at Ukraine, that they're going to stop trying to expand and continue to take even more territory after that. And when you're just letting when you're letting a sovereign nation in Europe fall like that, it's just one more that can continue to cycle for expansion of Russian troops. Also, like they said, expansion of the largest nuclear power in the world by tonnage, and further into Europe, which is exactly the opposite of what NATO is trying to do. And if we're going to commit to NATO, we have to commit to NATO's ideals and its mission. And I think part of that mission, even though Ukraine is not a NATO country, is to protect the stability of Europe and its borders, and to protect against Russia's expansion as a major nuclear and militaristic power.
See, what I don't understand
Well, if I can extend an olive branch here, J.D. Vance himself said that the idea about, this isn't necessarily backed up by any documentation, but he said the idea would be that Ukraine would be a buffer state between NATO and Russia. Try telling that to Russia. They were the ones to invade first. If they were to annex Ukraine further or to fully annex it, they would be expanding their own border with NATO by bordering Hungary and Poland. So, there's a world where we'd be willing to try Ukraine as a pure buffer state to prevent more stark or lopsided balance of power there. But at the end of the day, Russia shot first, and effectively they are expanding their own border with NATO at this point.
What I don't understand in this argument is because you're saying it's so important to, the difference here is that if NATO wanted to properly get committed and get involved, right, NATO tries everything they can not to make this a NATO issue because then Russia would be at war with all the NATO states. And that is what probably will prevent Russia from attacking Poland or Hungary because they are NATO members. And as soon as they attack Hungary or Poland, they'd be immediately at war with all main contracting powers. So that's the massive difference between Ukraine and the rest of Europe, which are part of NATO.
So you're saying that because Ukraine is not subject to Article 5, then it's
It this says like Russia wouldn't just continue conquering other countries in Europe because they are all part of NATO while Ukraine is not. So the risk of invading NATO is much lower for Russia than the risk of invading Poland or Hungary, for example, because that would immediately bring them into war with the entirety of NATO.
Well, I think you place a great degree of faith in Russia's cautiousness at this point, especially considering that they have been engaging in cyber warfare against NATO countries, which, because that's not covered by Article 5, they're able to get around in order to destabilize both the economies and the digital security of these countries, too. Again, if we want to take a more cautious approach on the part of NATO, Russia is significantly limiting the possibilities for us to be able to do that. And simply because these European nations affirm Article 5, that does not put us in any easier of a situation right here. And I'll be the first to argue that diplomacy is important and should be the main source of resolution for this conflict. The issue is that there should also be an equal burden on the country that invaded to come to the table and negotiate.
Any questions for the Libertarians? Oh.
I'm not for the Libertarians, for the Democrats. What's the end goal?
Sorry, if there is any questions for the Libertarians, can you take those? Okay. Okay, sorry. Please go ahead. Just wanted to stay balanced.
No, this is a question for the Democrats. This is very simple. What is the end goal of the war in Ukraine? In your perfect world, what is the end goal?
Well, I mean, the perfect world isn't necessarily a realistic one, but, return of Ukrainian territory and no encroachments from either side. And you guys did point out that there are militias in eastern Ukraine with Nazi leanings. Those wouldn't exist either. You asked for a perfect world, but,
Well, no, I can't give now to a realistic scenario.
All right, a realistic scenario. I'm not a scholar of international relations, but realistically, Russia has effectively controlled Crimea since 2014. I believe that's unjust and more of a cynical ploy for them to get a warm water port on the Black Sea so they can maintain economic global cooperation. But if the dubious election that they held there, that suggests that the majority of Crimeans want to be a member of the Russian Federation is sustained, then sure, they can keep that territory. The territory that they have gained since the illegal and offensive invasion in 2022 should not be respected by international law, and unfortunately, this does put the United States in a tough position to criticize Russia because we ourselves did the same thing in Iraq. George W. Bush actually had a pretty funny gaffe where he said Putin has launched an illegal invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, America has very little moral authority to comment on this issue. But what we want to achieve, like you, is peace, and we don't believe that peace is simply the absence of war, because this returns to us getting our principles from John Locke here. If Russia is to continue to govern itself as an oligarchy with secret police and repression of basic liberties, it would effectively be imposing a perpetual state of war on anybody it adds to its borders. And I can promise you that eastern Ukraine is not going to be a peaceful and flourishing region should it be added to the Russian Federation, whether it be because state violence or because of rebels who will continue to exist in the region.
About that point about the Russian political system needing to be overturned to promote a.
They should do that on their own. I'm not advocating for regime change.
Yeah, and
How would that be achieved?
Hmm?
How would it be achieved?
You know what? Certain countries are not ready for democracy. I'm willing to make that concession. the United States does not have a job to impose its worldview on other countries. We have a job to uphold the treaties that we've already written and to preserve global stability such that there is less war and less economic turmoil.
So I guess we're just in another, so I guess it's less of a victory and more of a, a status quo and development.
In a sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, you wanted to talk about a realistic outcome. I mean, obviously, in our ideal outcome, the war ends today, but that's just simply not realistic. And like Tom said, war and peace are not, they're not like collectively exhaustive opposites. What we need before just a strict end to the war is also a plan on how we're going to stop future Russian aggression and how we're going to promote democracy in Ukraine and their government's improvements, but also, like you said, in the long term, in Russia figuring out how to improve their system themselves. And in this war of attrition that they're in, their country and their economy like simply cannot endure falling growth rates forever. Because, like you said, their growth rates economically may not be falling as fast as some people assume they're going to. It is still at that point, it is still a receding economy over time, and I don't think that is stable or attainable long term for Russia, and I think eventually they're going to have to sort that out.
We've been kind of saying it for the past couple of years, though. Like, the economy's kaput, and all of a sudden there's they're barely scraping by, and all of a sudden there's growth, there's economic growth. Granted, it's it could be stagnating, it could be purely cyclical. However, that is certainly a point to consider.
I mean, we've been talking about the Ukrainian people's will to fight for a good portion of this debate, but I'm fairly certain that the Russian people are not in support of this war any more than the Ukrainians are. They do not want to be sending their sons to die in eastern Ukraine. They do not want to be diverting their resources in this effort. Before the invasion, Russia was very poor by European standards, and it remains so today. As much as economic indicators may see Russian growth over the course of the war, we need to remember the context for them, and that this is not necessarily fueling, number one, a morale boost, and more importantly, number two, a legitimacy boost for the government.
Any other questions?
I have a question regarding the
Oh,
housing.
sorry.
No, you first. Then I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
No, okay.
Yeah.
First I have a question. Can I have a question to both sides?
Of course, go for it.
Yeah, first I have a question to the libertarian side, because personally I just define myself as a libertarian, and I think the point for with the libertarian to really worry about is specifically the government involvement in an issue, right? So, for example, in the Ukraine issue, I don't know whether you agree with me. For me, it's like whether the government should involve in the war in Ukraine, which is far from the United States. And I'm just proposing a fictional scenario where now suppose that the government allow for American people to voluntarily help Ukraine, like. Because recently the Treasury Department just opened an account for American people to voluntarily deposit some money to pay back the national debt. So that's actually possible in the United States. So suppose that the United States government now start an account so that American people can pay into that account to buy shells, by weapons for the Ukrainian people. Then I think in much sense the government involvement should be like minimized, because we don't the United States no longer pay taxpayers' money on the war. So in that case, but in that case, the geopolitical and other concerns you propose are still there. Like the Ukrainian government is corrupt. Like the war will continue. Suppose that I'm just supposing that American people really support Ukraine, and many people really want to put their real money into their account. So in that case, we will agree with so in that case, while your concerns are still there, so will you no longer oppose the war to continue, or so my question is like, are you just against the government involvement or the war itself, or the or some other concerns? Because for me, I think my only concern is that the government involvement. If the government doesn't involve, it's fine. It's fine. Ukraine can choose to fight, and people in America can choose to support Ukraine or not. But so my question is that if the government involvement is now gone, so are you going to so what's your position on this? And for the democratic side, I think my question is about the rent control, because I think you did mention the zoning law and the housing supply. So my question is that again, so it's about the government involvement. So there are some ways to tackle to deal with the housing crisis with less government involvement. Like as you said, some of the I think the candidate for the New York City is now proposing to increase the housing supply, but I think he's proposing a way with more government involvement, like government funded affordable housing, right? So in that case, my question is that I want to remind both sides that the zoning law problem is actually a very, very big problem in America. I actually walked through the street in Brooklyn, and I just counted the number of stories for the new apartment. I found that few apartments actually have like more than 6 stories. It's a very real problem, and I noticed that many new apartments are just having the whole ground level as the parking lots. That will significantly reduce the units of the apartment. So I think that's definitely the priority for me. If I am in charge, I will definitely deregulate the zoning laws. I think that's definitely one way to decrease the government involvement in the housing market. And also I think on this point we also share some common ground, because Austin is run by Democrats, Chicago is run by Democrats, and actually if you go to Chicago, you notice that the rent in Chicago is like I'm not going to say half, but much lower than that in Boston. And Chicago is a big city with lots of people there, right? So and Austin is also a rising city. And also recently, I think there's a Senate bill in California just deregulating some of the the state-owned land for housing development. And I know even in Boston, which is a long-time NIMBY city, the government, the city government just proposed a bill to allow like 70. I think that's 700 for buildings as high as 700 feet. So basically, given these possible options to deregulate to increase the to deregulate the housing market, to increase the housing supply with less government involvement, do you still think rent control is the best option for you, or do you think that can be done simultaneously along with the deregulation, or maybe behind it, or maybe behind the priority of the deregulation?
Would you guys like to answer first?
Yeah. If you want to do the Ukraine thing first.
Sure. So I'm trying to get to the heart of your question. I believe it is that if the government were to set like an account where Americans could voluntarily fund it, would that be okay? I suppose from a strictly principle standpoint, it's supposed to be okay because it's voluntary. But I think from a more broad point of view, it wouldn't be, because unfortunately Putin is a product of the Cold War. And when he sees Americans, he thinks America as a whole in a very collective sense. And so I think he'd still see it as a provocation, but it would still be fine. Now, however, if it were a privately run thing, so it's not even connected to the US government at all, I think there's a lot of room for there still to be some meddling in there. So like I mentioned with the stuff like the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, stuff like that, they're all funded through USAID and other government-backed agencies. I say covertly, I mean it's open because it's on the register, but they don't talk about it. And if they get involved, then I mean it's still like the US government influencing politics in another country, and I still think that's wrong.
Okay. Was there a question for us on rent control in there, or was that the
No, it was
So far, no, but I may miss one.
We'll let that answer.
Okay,
Yeah.
I wanted to say first, well, yes, we do agree that zoning laws, things of that nature, are certainly harmful. Like you mentioned, the fact that so many first stories are reduced to parking lots. I think specifically, especially a lot of like private ownership of parking lots. You know, especially like a city like Boston too. That's still, even though it does have fairly robust public transit for an American city, is decently car-centric. We do agree that the government needs to reduce its hand in those aspects, but I don't think that the government needs to reduce its hand overall in fixing the housing market. And that's part of what we were getting at with Zoran's other proposals, and along with freezing the rent. In the United States, we don't have a ton of public housing. We certainly don't have as much public housing as many other countries and Western nations do. And there's a lot of stigma against public housing in the United States. Like even just what is historically carried, like the term Section 8 housing, for example, has just such a, I guess, negative connotation associated with it. And we think that's part of the problem here, is that people view this kind of government-created affordable housing as lesser than, or as just a method of creating more slums. And if we fully invest in efforts to create more government-created affordable housing, we can help get rid of this stigma. And then that, in combination with rent regulations, rent freezes, and things like that, will allow the market to stabilize so that we aren't choking the market with this rent stabilization. We're also presenting a destigmatized public alternative to housing that doesn't necessarily rely on complicated permits. Like, I know you guys gave an example of rent control. Was it Minneapolis? Was it?
Well, I give a lot of examples.
The one I was thinking of, yeah, Minneapolis.
Yeah, that was they instituted a rent control annually, like at 3%. They capped it, and then immediately after, the permit demands for new housing fell by 80%.
Exactly, and yes, and that is going to happen for overcomplicated permits that do involve a lot of these zoning regulations that we want to get rid of. But if you instead offer the alternative of affordable public housing, that could be a solution to help stabilize the market that prevents those negative outcomes. They really do both need to happen.
Yeah, like, and I'd like to make clear that as important as it is to abolish zoning laws, at the end of the day, if the main proprietor and benefactor in the housing market is the private sector, they're just going to build more luxury high-end developments because that's what's going to make them more money. We need to make sure that we have an established goal of housing as many people as possible in not just adequate housing, but good housing that allows them to find nearby work, that allows them to live safe and fulfilling lives without solely gearing it towards a profit motive. And other European countries and cities like Berlin and Vienna have found very effective ways of handling this.
Can I respond to that, or is that not allowed?
Are you guys okay with it?
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
sure.
It's funny that you say the luxury apartments are what happens when you abolish zoning laws and you don't have any rent control. Because that's actually what we see happen when you have rent control. Because what happens when you have rent control is you have all these regulated apartments and they're operating at below market price for the rent. So why would you, as a landlord, go and open up cheaper housing? Because everyone is going to demand that good below market price. So what you do is you only build the luxury stuff because that's what you are going to make money with. Why would you go and open up something that's competitive to the artificial below market price? So that's why you see less affordable housing being built. I say affordable housing just to mean like cheap housing, not actual government subsidized affordable housing. That's why you see less affordable housing being built in cities with rent control. It's because they can't make a profit based on the artificial below market price.
Well, you just mentioned increased demand there for the affordable housing. Wouldn't that incentivize them to build more of it?
No, because the demand would be for the below market rate, and no landlord's going to open up something with below market rate.
They wouldn't cater to this expanding market.
Some price for it.
Yeah.
Demand isn't just demand, it's demand for the price.
Yeah.
I do agree.
I only say that because you brought up the luxury apartments with.
I agree that
Yeah.
that's an issue, but that is why I put forth why public housing is such an important part of this. Because you're right, there isn't a ton of profit incentive to build affordable housing, and that's part of the issue with the capitalist structure that we impose on housing in this country. That housing in this country is a commodity. It's the construction of housing is driven by how are we going to make a profit off of this housing, and I fundamentally believe that that is the wrong way to approach it, and that we should approach housing as a human right and as something that will enable economic freedom and personal liberty, and not just what will allow for the profits for those creating housing.
I mean, I have a couple things, but well, I don't. First of all, like everyone, thank you guys for doing this. It's super impressive and like great work. I feel like that's a. I don't want to like contend, but I think that's a little bit like an idyllic vision that like it's a human right. But you guys can feel free to like explain more how that like would work specifically. But I wanted to talk a little bit about like the New York City housing specifically because you're talking about public housing, which would be built by the government. And I know one example in California, they had like allocated $20 billion to build homeless housing, and they like never actually ended up building any of that. And so that's like one point for why like the free market might be more efficient at like supplying the actual demand. And then I'm curious, like, where do you know where the current New York City budget stands? And if it's already at capacity, like where are you raising more of that money? Because we have, New York City has its own city tax, you have your federal income tax, and then you have state income tax. So some people would end up paying almost like 50% of their income. So like, where does the human rights come in there to like your own earnings and like how do you factor in those sorts of ideas?
If you want, I can read off Zoran's plan for raising money, and you can say if you agree with it or not, or you can just give
I'd
your
like
own.
to address mainly his question on California.
Yeah.
So I
I'm from
Personally fired up,
no, so I was working for my state senator over the summer, and one of the bills that he helped spearhead was a rollback of the California Environmental Quality Act, which, among other things, did significantly create a backlog within the permitting process in building new developments. So this right here is an experiment that I think the Libertarians can get behind, and we'll see what the impact of this form of deregulation is. I don't remember the specifics of the rollback, but it will be implemented in tandem with California's current housing regulations and the current targets on building affordable housing. However, I should note that those targets are also not the most reliable metrics to go by because there remains no enforcement mechanism for the state when localities do not meet those targets.
Thank you. Any other points?
You want to talk about New York?
Let's talk about.
But he wanted to read down.
I was just gonna.
Oh, sorry, that makes
He
sense,
asked
yeah.
how like
Yeah,
you want to
yeah,
pay for it. I was just gonna So Zoran says raise corporate tax rate to max New Jersey's 11.5%. He says that'll bring in $5 billion. Tax the wealthiest 1% of New Yorkers, those earning above 1 million annually, a flat 2% tax. Right now, city income tax rates are essentially the same whether you make 50,000 or 50 million. Implement common sense reform, blah blah blah. Raise an additional 1 billion. So, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was gonna mention that that corporate tax rate, especially is important because again, this isn't an unprecedented raise that he's proposing. Like literally right next door, that's the rate that they have there, and I think that also people's counterpoint a lot of the time to these tax raises that Zoran proposes is that billionaires will leave New York, but New York is the financial hub of the United States. I just think that's unlikely. I mean, all like the modern, I guess, U.S. economy is so intrinsically tied to Wall Street, and a lot of the whole economy, is so intrinsically tied to Wall Street. And New York is just such an important center and New York has a lot of very, very wealthy people, a lot of billionaires, and like Zoran said there, just even raising a corporate tax rate to that of New Jersey brings in $5 billion. That certainly could be used to build affordable housing. And also, even if somebody is paying 50% of their income in tax rate, it's not totally unprecedented in other countries around the world. And also, I'd like to note that I don't believe anybody in this country right now is paying anywhere near that in effective tax rate either. Even if the top tax brackets are that high, nobody does pay anywhere near that much of their money currently, at least. And also, sorry, what was I gonna say? So those increased taxes on the wealthiest of New Yorkers is certainly a way to fund these kind of ideas that we propose.
And yeah, no, I'd like to add to that. And if Zoran implements 100% of his policy agenda, there will still be billionaires in New York City. Not just because they didn't move, but also because they will still be able to accrue that much money.
That makes sense. Do you mind if I ask another, or do you want to
other
You
questions?
want
Yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah, you can go right ahead.
This will kind of be to both, admittedly, a little bit more of a challenge for Democrats, but taking a step back on the rent thing, why is there an issue to begin with? Because we've only been talking about fixing an issue, and I want to point out that it's not an American issue. It's mostly particular to specific cities. Like Houston does not have a rent rent issue. So you mentioned most of what's driving it is coordination of landlords. But is there any evidence of that? And why are these particular cities able to have better coordinated landlords compared to Houston or non-cities?
I don't know if we said most of it, but we did cite a DOJ study that said there was a good deal of
Yeah, they said that. But can I have a mechanism for what?
For how to
Because
investigate
cartels are hard to maintain unless you have barriers to entry. So do you have a mechanism for what's allowing them to get away with coordination compared to other similar American cities?
You can compare it to the way that telecom and energy providers work. You know, they have their own established territories. They don't encroach. upon
Established by the government, yeah. I don't think that's comparable because they're established by the government.
Well, I mean, again, we can talk about government-sponsored monopolies another time, but the fact that they are established still allows these landlords to engage in a market that is fundamentally not competitive. What we're defending right here is, you know, honestly just a chance for capitalism to actually allow itself to play out before we pursue any other policies, because again, landlords have established themselves such that they can control prices directly.
So still just not really seeing how. But
Not saying how the crisis unfolded.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not familiar with the specifics of Houston, but, you know, again, a large part of it, we'll concede, is urban planning. We believe that zoning laws should be repealed. At the same time, though, that will take a while, and we believe that there will be necessary government intervention to provide relief to renters while the process of undoing the harmful effects of suburban sprawl takes place.
that's what.
I have a question. Sorry, no, you were first.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I appreciate the support for, getting rid of zoning laws and all that. But the point of.
I don't know anybody who stands by zoning laws, by the way. Like,
Apparently everyone in government, so.
Corporate.
Yeah. For whatever reason, they're still in place. But the whole reason why you would support abolishing zoning laws is to increase the housing supply. But maybe you'll contend this, but rent controls restrict the housing supply, either directly or just indirectly through their fallout effects. So I don't see the point of saying you need both when one is intended to increase the supply and the other is unintended decreasing the supply. So I don't know why you're linking those in tandem like that.
Well, yeah.
Or if that's an unfair phrasing, you could tell me why you support, like, when you say we want to abolish zoning laws, what is your goal with that? And how does rent control not interfere with that goal?
Well, our goal for that is certainly, like you said, to give builders a mechanism to build more housing that they can't build. I mean, regardless of whether it's affordable housing or not, obviously we'd like it to be. But like you said, there is still an appeal in building higher end housing and expanding the cities in other ways other than affordable and low income housing. And if your goal is, or if your question is, we implement rent control, and then how are landlords supposed to make a profit now that we're essentially just capping their profits? And it's, we're giving you an avenue to build, but whatever type of housing you want. And that's why we say it's so important to increase alternative housing supplies, so like public housing, things of that nature. So you can still give landlords the opportunity to build whatever kind of housing is going to make them a profit in the market, while also supporting low-income communities and giving them a fair housing opportunity.
So you admit it's restricting the supply a little bit, but you're saying that's an added trade-off to make sure that it's affordable.
Yes,
Less
exactly.
affordable. Okay.
I have a question regarding the German study. So I'm German myself, and the real estate market there is very different. So you have not as much private ownership, you have a lot of government ownership, you have a lot of ownership by what's called Wohnungsgenossenschaft, which is basically a non-profit organization that is building apartments and renting out apartments for the sake of equity. And a lot of the private owners are much more centralized. So you can have an owner in the very south of the country that owns properties in cities in the north coast. So how do you think this study from Germany is comparable with American state of affairs, even though their real estate markets and their systems are completely different?
One of the options you mentioned sounds similar to what certain cities in the U.S. have pursued, community land trusts. What was the German term again?
Wohnungsgenossenschaft.
What does that translate to?
That means basically, it's very hard to translate it as Genossenschaft comes from comrade. So it's yeah, it's a socialist. It's like a conglomerate of comrades basically that
Right.
own something conjointly, but it's basically a trust. And Wohnung just means apartment.
I mean, yeah, those land trusts that you just mentioned right there, those to me bear a resemblance to the Red Vienna that arose after World War I, where housing was controlled both by local governments, by organized communities in tandem, and they were able to provide this necessity to the populace. So yeah, I'll admit that there is an issue in comparing the German housing market to the United States, but fundamentally, if there are regulations in place in Germany, which does still have commodification of land, not to the extent that the U.S. does, but still has it, and that those regulations are not producing significantly adverse outcomes for renters, I don't see why I don't see why we should flat out dismiss rent control out of hand while also pursuing the much more diverse and clearly more effective market that Germany has established.
Would you support an alternative of just direct subsidization rather than price control? Because I think for economists, that's overwhelmingly a much better approach. Is doing the same thing and just effectively giving them a lower price by direct subsidy.
Is that for the renters or for the landlords?
For the renters.
Like, as in providing
Which, it also has other issues. That's how our education system is set up. Look how bad it is. But still, I would prefer that to price control.
In the past handful of years, like the Department of Housing and Urban Development actually has made efforts to move away from, like I was saying, secondary housing. I don't think they actually technically even use that term anymore for any of their housing, and they have made more of a push to move to a voucher system for renters rather than providing the housing itself, and instead, like you said, leaving it up to market prices for housing and then subsidizing it on the renter side. But just at least immediately in the past few years, I just don't think it's worked spectacularly effectively. It's rents have still stably increased just as much, if not faster than wages in places like New York City. And so I just think moving away from public housing because it had all this negative stigma around it, and I'm not saying a system like that can't work, but just I don't know if we've necessarily seen incredible benefits from it so far. And so I don't think there's any harm, especially at a local level, of trying something else.
Go ahead.
I'm just trying to challenge you guys a bit on where do you think the largest deficiency is with having our current state of housing in New York, for example? Does anyone have the numbers on what the homeless population is in New York City? How much more demand for housing there is? Who aren't we supplying? That sort of idea.
Yeah, I cited something that said, I think it was a study from 2003, so granted, but it found that 21% of New Yorkers lived in apartments that were either bigger or smaller than they would have been if they were in a completely unregulated market. This is either because they got a rent-controlled apartment and they really liked it because it was below market rate, and so they stayed in it, regardless of if they actually needed it or not, or the inverse of that. And so there's a lot of misallocation problems. So that's who, not being housed, even though they technically have an apartment, it's not the most market efficient apartment for them. And I just say probably the biggest problem would be kind of a generic term, but like anti-build people, like NIMBYs, you know that term? And, huh?
Not in my backyard.
Yeah, there you go. Basically that, but like widespread. It's starting to, I mean, he mentioned Houston. Houston's doing fine, but that's starting to crop up more and more. And that kind of affects local zoning laws a lot, especially. And so pretty much just anti-build people in general would be the cause of that and everything that affects that. So I don't know if that was.
Yeah, I mean, I think
but
one more point on that. I don't mean to hold anyone, sorry, you guys, but I guess I'm just curious, like also with the current state of things, I feel like sort of even with capitalism itself, we're just kind of seeing up and to the right in terms of pricing. Perhaps there'll be like a large drop and a reset, but we're seeing like building materials continue to go up in price year after year. That's like why you're seeing a lot of the rent climbing. But yet we still have like not really any wage growth, at least like on the bottom tier. So at what point does your rent turn into like $4,000 a month and you're pricing out like, you know, in larger and larger and larger groups of individuals, and what's your kind of take on that? And how do you address that going into the future?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not exactly sure what the wage growth numbers are in terms of real wage growth in the U.S. But yeah, there are issues with that. We would pretty much just say any issue that you're pointing to now in our current system, I don't really think affects the points that we're making, because we're not arguing to operate in the current system. We want less regulation and more mechanisms to build and to expand the housing supply. So you say there's a problem now and it's getting worse, and that is definitely true, but I don't really think it doesn't affect the point we're making against rent control, and it also doesn't affect like our ideal system, because we wouldn't have any of those restrictions in there. But
Had wages kept up with productivity since 1968, the minimum wage would be $21.45 right now. It's currently $7.25, hasn't been raised since 2009. And what I would argue is the solution to this, to channel a little bit of theory here, something more envisioned by Polanyi, in that we have this double Hungarian economist from back in the day. Yeah, ridiculous shit.
Sorry.
As we have economic growth, we should see some double movement, in the sense that welfare states and that government intervention catches up in order to make sure that the economy is truly reflective of both the needed conditions of working people and also of the amount that they're producing.
So you're saying like ideally, as the economy grows, like the welfare grows in accordance, like in proportion to the same. So
Yeah.
maintain.
Otherwise, we're just wasting money on ineffective programs.
I guess that assumes that you have like the right proportion of welfare, if that makes sense. Like, do you know what I mean by that or no?
As in like
redistribution.
As in like you're properly like reallocating and regrowing your welfare as the economy grows to like maintain the right balance of welfare. Like where is that right balance? Do we have any idea?
job for economists and public policy people to figure out.
Well, I wasn't saying. Oh.
Okay.
Well, I think
we can trust them.
I think it's so important, like Tom said, and I guess like you were getting at there, to as an economy grows, to also increase welfare in tandem with that, because if you just let the economy grow by itself, money will grow and just continue to funnel towards the top. Like most of the wealthiest Americans are making money off of investments that they don't think about on a week-to-week or even month-to-month basis. And when they're making so much in unrealized gains, and then that continues to just, their wealth expands exponentially compared to the bottom of the country, which then in comparison is shrinking. And so just over time, if you don't adjust for a growing economy, I think money just continues to funnel up towards the top, and that's why things like an unrealized capital gains tax and measures like that to combat this kind of funneling up towards the top are so important.
Do you have a question?
Oh yeah, I do have a question, but it's about the Ukraine thing. So
I wanted to continue on that and hear your guys' answer. So, like in my opinion, so I personally feel like I lean more to like the libertarian group, where I identify with that. However, I think that what they're advocating for over time makes a bit more sense to honestly take from the top and prop up the bottom to some extent, or whether it's through just artificial government. However, I'd like to hear what your guys' opinion is on how you can essentially keep like a base level of human livability, I don't know, a quality of life, I guess, without having to redistribute or like, put a hand on the market, essentially.
I could be wrong here, but I think that, well, it's true, wealth inequality has gotten much worse. Everyone is doing better now than they were previously. So you can point to that and say,
When is previously?
pretty much, like, time passed in terms of quality of life, in terms of,
Yes, everyone's doing better now than they were 100 years ago.
yeah.
Like,
And also in terms
That's
of,
a good thing.
also in terms of just money. Like, the rich have gotten richer faster than the poor have gotten richer, but the poor have also gotten richer. So you can point to the wealth inequality and say that's bad, but I don't really think it's all that big of an issue as long as everyone's getting richer. And I mean, we can talk about like the Fed devaluing currency and all that, but if we don't want to get into that, I don't know what their opinions on the Fed are. But.
I think that's gonna be a long conversation.
Yeah, so that'd be the long answer.
Yeah.
But
I think just to preface, to put it in context, I think the Democrats said at some point about the Ukraine argument, it was very important for the United States that it keeps its treaties and therefore its legitimacy. Russia and the U.S. had a lot of treaties in the past, armament treaties about damaging armament, and most of them the United States actually pulled out of. So they broke the armament agreements first. But that's actually not what I want to ask about. My question is for both sides actually, but I would like for the Libertarians to start maybe. What do you guys believe is the security interest for the ultimate game for the Russian side? What is their plan in this conflict? Because I feel like if we want to really respond with policy, right, we need to know, or we need to at least have some sort of assumption of what our opponent is actually trying to achieve. And that's what I want to know from both of you, what you're thinking, because I think your opinion is very different, but none of you stated it outright what you think, what your Russian objection is.
Well, I'd say that, at least from my perspective, I'd say that Russia's and Putin's expansion desire is essentially just like a sphere of influence, like the U.S. has. What I perceive that Russia perceives is that their sphere of influence has been shrinking since the fall of the Soviet Union, and I feel uncomfortable with that. I feel everyone does. I didn't get to mention this during the debate because I've been just throwing stuff together. But in 2008, there was a memo from William Burns. He was the ambassador to Russia for the United States at the time. He sent it to Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State for W. Bush. He's essentially saying that, this is from Putin's mouth, that expansion of NATO towards Russia was seen as a provocation of Russian aggression, and should that expand into a country like Ukraine, then it would lead Russia to a decision that it did not want to have to make. So, like I said, Russia sees our movement as encroachment on their territory, their perceived territory. I don't think it extends much farther than Ukraine. I don't think they want Finland. I mean, if they wanted Finland, they would have taken Finland before they joined NATO. So, Ukraine, Georgia, that's it.
do you think an increase in NATO membership is inherently a provocation towards active aggression towards Russia?
Increase in which direction? Like eastward?
Yeah, do you think the fact that Poland is in NATO is inherently a provocation
Yeah.
towards the security of Russia?
I do.
So you think that NATO would be launching offensive operations against Russia?
I didn't say that. I just think Russia perceives it.
Well, okay, but like for it to be an actual provocation, there would have to be some evidence of an intent to attack. Now,
Not necessarily. Yeah, there would have to be like I'm not saying that Putin's a fully rational actor and he thinks it's going to be a provocation. I'm just saying like he's nervous because he sees what used to be the Soviet Union's opponent is now getting really close to his country.
why do you think NATO has been expanding since the end of the Cold War?
I think because it just wants to expand its sphere of influence. I think we have like honest intentions. We just want to build relationships. But I think we're not doing it in a way that brings Russia into a fold well enough where they think that we're just trying to be honest. I think our duplicity in this situation is kind of provoking them into trying to fight back against it.
would you call the Finland becoming part of NATO a provocation or no? Because you said you felt like iffy about that, right?
I felt iffy
So-
about it not because it was a provocation, but because that is indicative of the conflict increasing. Because now I don't know how many miles the Finnish-Russian border is,
Yeah.
but it's a much longer NATO
It's a lot.
border now. I would say that Finland and Sweden quite reasonably fear that Russia would attack them had they not been under Article 5's security. And while they do have that added layer of security on paper, it is not reflective of the problem being solved. I will concede that we are not approaching peace just by redrawing the Cold War era lines.
May I interject here, because we're like the security interest thing, why would Russia, think that there might be a threat from NATO, right? It's the same as with the Cuba crisis. Just because Cuba moved its nuclear weapons to, or Russia moved its nuclear weapons to Cuba, doesn't mean that it's an immediate plan to attack America from Cuba, right? But for example, Germany, my home country, hosts a plethora of American military stations, and some of them have nuclear weapons. And the fear of Russia is that if Ukraine will be subsumed by NATO, that NATO will station nuclear weapons in Ukraine that have a much closer reach than to Moscow and the rest of Russia than, for example, Germany would.
Well, once again, as as European leaders fear American withdrawal, they're using the creating their own nuclear program. So I don't really see this sort of halt in NATO expansion as necessarily the means to produce a denuclearized Europe.
But do you not recognize that the fear of Russia is exactly the same fear that the United States had when Russia moved nuclear warheads to Cuba?
Yeah, no, I think they're somewhat analogous in this case. Yeah.
Also, I want to ask, I have no clue of the facts of any of this. Is there evidence that Russia or Putin actually does want to expand into NATO? Obviously, they've expanded into like Georgia and other non-NATO countries, but the only evidence I know of aggression against NATO is Ukraine sending a missile there and into Poland, like that. So, is there any actual real scare of Russia expanding into the rest of NATO?
In the years prior to the conflict, they were building up their troop presence on the Baltic borders, which may not necessarily be an indication that they were trying to invade, but obviously that is not a sign that
But
they
that's
were
the same
willing to-
thing as NATO building up closer to Russia. See?
Hmm?
That's the same exact thing as NATO building up troops closer to Russia.
Right, but
As them building up troops close to NATO. It's the same exact thing.
was Baltic membership in NATO necessarily a encroachment on Russian sovereignty? Because I have not seen any evidence to suggest that NATO operations in the Baltic states were, number one, close enough to the Russian border to merit concern on the part of the Russian Federation, and number two, designed to elicit some sort of sense of fear from Russia. Because I'll agree that with the what was it, the Collective for Peace or
Excuse me 1 second. It's the PFP, something.
Yeah. That group has not pursued the necessary provisions to secure peace between the West and Russia. I'll agree with that. And obviously, there are a good number of neoconservative politicians in the United States who would like to see a hot conflict with Russia, who I think their views should be completely dismissed. We need to be careful that we are not ignoring the fact that Putin is ideologically in favor of expanding Russia's borders, that he then very likely believes that for whatever irrational reasons that he might argue through security, that Russia is better suited having a larger border in Europe, that it would be best suited being similar to the borders of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, and that Russia is not interested in pursuing peace. They're interested in pursuing their own interests above all else.
And I think it's also fair to mention that Russia certainly has not, or certainly has shown that they're not afraid to meddle in NATO affairs and to meddle in cyber warfare and in things like our own election. It is proven fact that there was significant Russian interference in the 2016 election.
$40,000 bots, yeah.
Yeah, and so those sort of, I guess, cyber warfare-esque variations, I think that is still can be considered aggression against NATO, and I think it's fair to take that as evidence of not necessarily provocation, but still certainly
A word, for
intent
sure.
to disrupt.
5 days ago.
Can I give a bit of context on the Russian situation? So, because you mentioned a couple of things, but you got them slightly, maybe twisted. Like because the missile attack, for example, in Poland, that was not intentional.
Oh, I know, but it's just ironic that
We
they're
had
the only ones that
like
actually did
in the
it.
Georgian war, that was actually a reaction to provocations by Georgia, and they were in front of the capital and then agreed to withdraw. So they could have taken Georgia if they wanted to, but the Russians agreed not to and to withdraw from Georgia. And what some people speculate what had a part in the start of the Ukraine war was that America, or the Democrats in the Biden administration, felt they had a massive geopolitical loss with the withdrawing of the troops from Afghanistan. They felt they were losing face as a world power. And so they were taking up a lot of controls along the Russian borders. There were more flights by NATO, kind of going over Russian territory, like survey flights. There were harsher radar controls. So Russia felt more threatened by this kind of posturing of the United States. And what I think, that's just speculation on my part, but I think what Russia was trying to do, they also need to try to save face. Putin needs to try to save face politically, geopolitically, that they are not too weak to cave into like the threat of NATO or the United States, but also to their own government. He says like, I'm staying strong, I'm not giving into foreign pressure. And I think he was trying to kind of scare the Ukrainians, because a similar situation was there was a lot of skirmishes in the border territories between Russia and Ukraine shortly before the Ukraine conflict. And I think when he was at the point that he had his army at the border, it was kind of like the same with the nuclear crisis, like in Cuba, who's pushing the button, or do I invade, do I not invade, do I show strength, or do I pull back and show weakness? And I think Russia, like Putin made himself by drawing the army at the border into a situation where he could not retreat. And then he had to commit, and once the war starts, things get messy, you cannot just pull out of the war. But I think it indicated that Russia didn't really want this conflict, was that they were really quickly, 2 months after the beginning of the war, willing to negotiate peace, when actually the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during that time actually flew into Ukraine and said, Boris Johnson, the West is not ready to make peace at this point, and this is why the war continued at this point forward.
Okay, so we can just take one last question and then wrap up. If there's no one else, do you guys mind if I ask you a question? Of course. In the intersection, you guys talked about how you wouldn't necessarily call yourself Democrats because you don't actually sort of identify with the party. My question is, you propose all of these sort of government interventions in a good manner with good intentions. Would you trust the current political class with those? Or would you prefer to, I don't know, have some sort of other type of election or other type of government to handle all of these interventions?
The main issue with, well, at least my main issue with the Democratic Party is twofold. Both policy-based, in that I think they are nowhere near ambitious enough to improve the lives of everyday citizens, but also that they're not even good at what they purport to do, which is to be defenders of liberalism. They, have failed to facilitate a commerce-based market that actually allows for competition that could ostensibly produce, beneficial outcomes for all who participate. They have failed to defend civil liberties. They have failed to support diplomatic engagement above other avenues around the world, and generally, they are just completely feckless even when they try to pursue more more illiberal initiatives, like we saw with the bipartisan border bill that got killed in, I want to say, 2024 or 2023, somewhere around that. 2024, yeah. So I have next to no faith in the Democratic Party to message properly or win national elections for the foreseeable future. I have more faith in the administrative capacity of the competent people who were working in the government before Elon Musk came in to actually implement policy. It wasn't perfect, but I would, I would vociferously argue that the Project 2025 personnel is policy mantra is not effective for leading a cohesive and organized society. And while I would adopt the label of, progressive in this conversation, given that we were talking about welfare states and about foreign policy, that is not my political horizon, and I think that we can both agree on someday in the future it would be beneficial for there to be a less state-oriented society and one where people could freely associate much more although of course, you may view it through a more commerce-based system, and I may view it through a more communitarian and system that values
I think
the rights of labor.
we also agree with the communitarian view too. So would you, just to sort of wrap up on that, like what do you think about the idea of a national divorce or like more community-based governance?
Okay.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Well, I guess I wanted to get in on like too, especially on my issues with the Democratic Party leadership right now is that, I mean, not even just recently, but even back to 2016. I mean, we meddle in our own primaries. Like, for example, like take like Bernie Sanders' candidacy. Like the Democratic establishment was very much so doing everything they could to keep him down, and it's like I forget when Bernie Sanders initially entered that race against Hillary Clinton. His polling, like it looked as if he had no chance, and he gained all of this incredible momentum that the Democratic establishment was just kind of freaking out at. And then he eventually ended up losing, of course, and then we saw how that turned out for the Democrats in the 2016 election. And if the current Democratic establishment is going to put down our own popular candidates, like for example, take like Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, not endorsing
Yeah, the Zoran thing.
Zoran, he's the Democratic candidate, and it's like you guys are New York legislators. He is unbelievably popular. He's one of the few people that we're proud to host under our big Democrat tent right now. That is ascendant, and if we're going to continue to just put down these ascendant candidates and what we are like convinced on is what the country really wants, we're denying what the country is actually showing us that they want. And I think that's the biggest issue with the Democratic establishment. And I don't necessarily agree with this national divorce sort of argument either, because I think the political spectrum here is just, it's a little bit more complicated than the Democratic and the Republican Party. Like I think currently the Democratic Party, I guess, encompasses a much wider base of voters than the Republican Party certainly does. I just dispersed is what I mean. I think right now the Republican Party's message is actually somewhat unified. It's unlike ours.
I don't know about that, but yeah, sure.
But yeah, but I mean,
Well, to the point on a national divorce, like, I wouldn't put it that way. I think I would put it more towards a global unification in which, we understand ourselves as human beings above all, not geared towards simply being productive agents in the economy, but, trying to create a condition in which we can all live the most free and fulfilling lives possible.
yeah,
We have not
ideal.
We have not graduated to the maturity necessary to achieve that, whether it be for politics or religion, but it's a nice thought.
Yeah, and I also want to be clear. I wasn't like trying to say that
Right.
I like support like dividing on party line or that one party is more ideologically, I guess, like polarizing the other. Obviously, that approach I agree with. I just don't think like even say you split up red and blue there. I think.
It doesn't have to be red and blue, it can be just counties or states.
Yeah. Even then, I think within those, there's still so much disagreement that I think there's still so much political conflict in there that I just don't. I think the entire country working out all of these things in various different counties like together collaboratively is so more effective approach.
And are you envisioning like a one world government, or was that just like an ideal that we should cooperate with each other internationally, globally, like as in like free markets? Or are you saying no, we should have a one world government where we are all under one state?
I'm trying to say in as many words as possible without saying it with the label that I am more sympathetic to Marxist vision.
Okay.
What was that?
More sympathetic towards Marxist vision.
Okay.
It's not immediately possible.
It was not my quote.
I think really quick comment, what I noticed with like the federal elections and also with the European elections, the wider the net is cast, the less vote, and the more parties exist, because if you want a world government, there will not only be Republicans and Democrats are going to be voting most parties. The less the voter of the locale, like the municipality or the county, will actually get out of the elections, because there's so many different things that so many different areas of the world need. And a central government that works with the election systems we have in place right now for the EU or the federal government will not be able to accurately reflect or, going for the interests of the actually local community.
I should clarify this. I'm not calling for, a bureaucratic, bourgeois, liberal mess of, the EU, but on a global scale. What I'm saying is a stateless society, which is somewhat in line with, which is somewhat more in line with Karl Marx's vision, but we can do that as a libertarian versus Marxist part two, and I promise you I will commit to positions more so than they did.
Yeah, dude. I mean, that was.
To get a last, just a last word in here too, especially on this national divorce or right. I think a lot of people forget that in the 2024 presidential election, turnout rate was 64%. 36% of the country is not voting for the president. They're just straight up not voting. That. So you're leaving out an entire third of the country when you talk about this being so ideologically split, or even within this left, or within the left wing of American politics, even we're so ideologically split. Remember that there is an entire other third of the country here that isn't necessarily participating in that. It doesn't necessarily have an interest to participate in that. So we do need to account for those differences.
And as a last word to clear that up, the reason why we have argued under the banner of progressive Democrats here, and why I have not argued under the banner of, socialism right here, is because the Democratic Party apparatus has a lot of work to do. You guys know what you want. Democratic voters know what they want. Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries do not know what the hell they're doing.
I think they know what they want. I just don't think it's self-interest. Yeah.
If they did, they'd be able to govern. If they did, they'd be able to govern effectively.
Yeah.
But what we're saying is that Democratic voters want a more progressive, social democratic, welfare type system. We will defend that as a means to create as much peace as possible in a society of capitalist states, and to ensure that progressive governance can exist as a means to protect individual freedom.
So what you're saying is you want more money to Israel?
That's what I heard. All right, that was a good note. That was a good one.
It's not our quote. It's not our quote. Yeah, thanks so much.
Good.
Yeah, very